give you whatever information or insight that you might be curious about it. I'll start talking a little bit, and then we can take your questions and you pick my brains, what's left of them. And Mark is on his way, as far as I know. He texted me about 30 minutes ago and said, see you there. I was raised in Perryton and graduated in 1962, and couldn't wait to get out of the Panhandle. I never wanted to see another tumbleweed or cotton gin or dust storm. And my roots are pretty deep on my mother's side. My great-great-grandparents were among the Quakers who settled the first town on the South Plains, which was Estacada. It was a community of Quakers who wanted to get away from the Gentiles, which is what they call the Baptists and Methodists. And so they came to the South Plains. Obviously, it must have been a good year, or they wouldn't have stayed. And they were farmers, and so my roots go deeply there. My mother she was a rancher's daughter in Seminole, and I was born in Midland. So it's an odd background for somebody who turned out to be a writer. When I was growing up, nobody in my family or school or town knew that somebody from Perryton could be a writer. And so I had to kind of back into it. And that's Mark, the little guy who just walked in. Mark, you want to come on up here and we'll sit together, and unless you're ashamed of your scene with me.
Well, I'll get over it. Is anybody using this?
But it was just, nobody knew that a kid from the windblown Panhandle could aspire to be a writer. We thought they all lived in New York and London and were all dead. So I never wrote much of anything when I was in high school or grade school either. But I did get a solid background in grammar, which I'm really grateful for. And one of the things I say I wrote a book for aspiring writers because I get a lot of mail and emails from aspiring writers, and I decided it would be better just to go ahead and do a book and give my best effort. It's called Storycraft, Meditations on Faith, Culture, and Writing. And so I talk a lot about my background, and then one of the things, I have a section for advice to writers, and one of the first things I say is don't write anything that would shame your mother. And that probably sounds corny to people from the big city, but that's a piece of wisdom that has stayed with me, and I think it's pretty good advice. My mother was not a writer, but she was a storyteller, and she raised me on Bible stories and stories of my grandfather and great-grandfather who were cowboys. And I don't think that I've written anything that would have shamed her. She didn't live to read my first book, Through Time in the Valley. She died a year before that book came out. But another thing I advise is diagram sentences in your head. I got a real good background in sentence diagramming. In the 8th grade, I had the meanest teacher in Aqua Creek County. She was a little old woman who wasn't the least bit intimidated by 8th grade boys who thought they were tough. In toughness, we were pretenders. She was the real deal. She didn't give a rip what we thought of her. And she made us learn how to diagram sentences. And it's a wonderful discipline because I still do it in my head. And when I edit other people's work, I'm amazed that they don't understand that the verb and the subject have to be the same, and that it's better to use active voice instead of passive voice. It's hard to diagram passive voice. It's easy to diagram the active voice. So one of the best sentences ever written was Jesus wept. Everybody knows what it means. You don't have to go to college and take a writing course to write that sentence. Any 3-year-old can comprehend that you have combined a person with an action. And it even contains some emotion. You don't have to say, he wept sorrowfully and bitterly. It's all in that one word. So for me, a large part of my apprenticeship was learning when to shut up and what not to say. And also I had to figure out who I was writing for. I started off writing for editors in New York, and they were not impressed that I was from Aqua Creek County, Texas. And I went to writers conferences. I was in the Western Writers of America for 8 years when Chris and I couldn't afford the dues, much less the hotel bill and the travel. But I went and I chased New York editors around hotel lobbies and talked to New York editors to try to figure out what they wanted. And I really tried to write what I thought they wanted, and it still didn't work. So I either had to, after 15 years, I think I added up my income for those 15 years and it came out to 13 cents an hour. I had a wife and 2 kids and this went on the way. And I either had to give up and quit or do something different. And I knew nothing about publishing. There wasn't even a bookstore in my town. But I was raised by people who hated to get whipped, especially by somebody from the other side of the Mississippi River. And we're resourceful people, and we learned how to find a book designer in Omaha, Nebraska, and he found a printer in Michigan. And on September the 1st, 1982, I took my first delivery of my first self-published book. And the reason I did that, I knew the stigma that's attached to self-publishing, but I thought that I could find readers and that I needed readers and not editors. And I thought I could write stories that people in my town and area would make them laugh. And so my theory has been to shape my writing, in the same way that the lady in our town makes tortillas. And that is, every time you make a batch, it has to be with quality material, and it has to bring some kind of pleasure to the people who pay you for them. And if you give them too much hot sauce or not enough meat or give them tainted material, they're not going to buy any more. So I tried to make people laugh, and I tried to use humor that was not malicious. It was not trying to ridicule people. It's just laughter that I found in my work as a cowboy. I call it organic humor, and it's humor that revolves around people who work with animals and live out in the country and often tell stories. So my Hank the Cowdog books are, that writing voice was not the writing voice I was looking for when I was trying to be a New York author. It's the writing voice of people who live on ranches and farms and sit around the table after supper and tell stories. And you know, people, when they tell stories at weddings, funerals, after graduations, at prairie fires, brandings, they're not dreary stories. They're usually funny. And so I kind of followed that lead. And I guess it's turned out pretty well. Self-publishing was never what I wanted to do. And after we brought out 10 Hank books, we found another publisher who was impressed that during the biggest oil bust in Texas history, they were getting truckloads of books back from B. Dalton and Walden Books, and we were selling Hank books at $6 a piece. And so that was Texas Monthly Press, and we were with them for a while, and then with Gulf Publishing in Houston, and then we moved it to Viking Penguin in New York, and they had those books for 12 years, and I think they sold 6 or 7 million of them. And then we got a letter saying they weren't going to renew the contract. So we had Maverick Books still in Perryton. We had kept it going because we never trusted them to start with. And so we had a big warehouse, and we said, we'll buy all your inventory. So we got a semi-load of Hank books that had Penguin's name on them, and they really know how to make beautiful books. And so I guess for the last 10 years, Hank has come back full circle, and we're in Perryton again. So this is my son, Mark.
Well, I guess I'm here to talk about the podcast and how we got into that. If y'all haven't checked it out, it's last fall we put out a podcast, Hank the Cowdog podcast. It's based on the 11th Hank book, Lost in the Dark Enchanted Forest, with Matthew McConaughey in the role of Hank the Cowdog, and then we've got a great cast on down from there, including this guy is Wallace the Buzzard.
Typecasting.
Yeah, born to play. So, and we put it out in 5 episodes on, all across different platforms. And so I guess the backstory on that, several years ago, we've been working with a filmmaker named Jeff Nichols. If you're not familiar with his name, you might have seen some of his movies. He did, probably his best known movie is Mud, starring Matthew McConaughey. And he's also done Take Shelter, Loving, Midnight Special. And at the time they got in touch with us, I had seen some of his movies. I didn't know his name, but I'd seen some of his movies, and I admired his movies. And especially the thing, I'd seen Mud and Take Shelter, not knowing that they were made by the same person. But both of them struck me as distinctly honest, and there wasn't a lot of flash It was very straightforward, honest storytelling with good characters and good story. And so I had an admiration for Jeff before I ever met him or knew who he was really. So I went down to Austin a little while after that to kind of, see who this guy is and what he has in mind for Hank. He had read that book, Hank number 11, to his, at the time, 6-year-old son. Jeff is an Arkansas guy, grew up in Little Rock, bounced around and then ended up in Austin, married to a Texas girl. And his wife had worked at Texas Monthly at one time, and somewhere in there got familiar with Hank and brought a Hank book home, and Jeff read it to his 6-year-old son, and presumably they enjoyed it. And I think, the mind of a filmmaker, when he reads a book, he's always thinking about, like, what would this look like as a movie or some kind of adaptation. So I think that's what was happening with Jeff when he was reading that to his son. He was envisioning it. And so anyway, I went down to Austin, spent a day with Jeff, just getting to know him, hearing what he wanted to do with Hank. And we had been working for some years at that time on a film or television adaptation, and had a few false starts, and so we're kind of already pursuing a vision. And when I went down and talked to Jeff, it was remarkable how much his vision kind of lined up with what we had in mind already without me having to say anything. So we thought this might be a pretty good partnership, one worth pursuing. So we did. And that's been a journey in and of itself. He wrote a feature film adaptation script that didn't go anywhere, and then the idea came about, bubbled up to do it as a podcast, break it up into episodes, cast the thing. We will produce it ourselves for a much lower budget number than what you could produce a movie or a television series for. Get it out there, establish the vision, establish the model, get the cast together, and do it that way, and then we'll tee it up for something bigger. So that's what we did. Jeff went back and I guess just kind of like tore up his feature film script on book 11 and went back to the book and rewrote it into 5 episodes of 19 to 22 minutes apiece. And for script writing, a page is basically about a minute of playtime. That's the rule of thumb. And, one of the things I love about Jeff is that he doesn't stray too far from the book. He stays very true to it. And I think the deal is, like, if he didn't love the book, he wouldn't have called us in the first place. So he didn't have the kind of desire to, make his mark on it just for the sake of making his mark. And when he did make a change, it made sense. It served a good purpose. That's what I thought anyway. And I thought he did a great job of adapting the book into the 5 episodes of podcast scripts. So he did that. We cast it. We formed a new company, and worked with. We got hooked up with a company out in California that specializes in narrative podcasts. Their game is they do scripted narrative podcasts, fiction. The company's called Cowdog, and they've done about a dozen of them at this point. But scripted out, cast it, voice recorded, full sound design, music composition, all that. So it's basically, it's most similar to I guess, a radio drama from back in the days before I was around. But that kind of model, that creative model, has kind of come back in that form, in the form of narrative podcast. So that's kind of the model, and we worked with their team, and put the cast together one at a time, and it was kind of an interesting experience of different stars of different levels and how they behave. It went all the way from one cast member having to cancel several times because she forgot that she had a dental reconstructive surgery, and another time because nobody called her a car and she doesn't drive, and to another cast member that just got the contract, signed it, and sent it back the same day with no changes, and everything in between. So the voice recording, it was done in the pandemic. So normally you would have the director in the studio with the cast members. They come in and they record their parts. We didn't do it that way this time for obvious reasons, but Q-Code was real nimble, and they were able to pivot and do something else. They put together these packages that included microphone, a little recording device, and everything that you would need to set up a little home studio to record. Sent these out by mail. Everyone opened it up, set it up, and then Jeff would get on, I guess, a Zoom call with them, and face to face on the screen, direct them and their parts. And McConaughey did his in Austin at a sound studio down in Austin, and then everybody else did it from home except Dad came over for his part and did it at a recording studio here in Amarillo, where he does all the audiobooks. So put it all together. It was a lot of work, very interesting process, a lot of hands on it, and put it out, I guess, September of last year.
Yep.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it was number one
in kids and family for the duration of its cycle. And then when episode 1 came out on the whole chart, it was in the top 10, I don't really care too much about a number specifically, but we were ahead of Oprah. And that's what really matters.
Our sponsor for that was HEB, and Mark did all the commercials. I don't think they paid him anything, but he did it, including singing a song.
Well, you helped with one of them too. Wallace the Buzzard made a guest appearance in one of the ads. After we cranked out enough boring ones that they felt they could trust us, they gave us a little leash, and we did one with it was a little bit more fun.
So how long did it take y'all from we're not going to make a movie, we're going to do a podcast, to launching the podcast? I mean, how fast because 2020 was so crazy. You said, this company pivoted fast. I mean, they had to pivot fast. So how long did it take y'all to decide to go from movie to podcast?
Let's see. Where would that have been in the timeline? It seems like it was maybe not quite a year between coming to that, like, all right, we're making this switch, and that was pre-pandemic. But the way these things go, at least in my experience, is there's a lot of stuff being done in a small group, deals getting made. How are we going to finance this? what's everybody's part, all that kind of stuff. And then you get to a certain point, and then it gets really big. A lot of people, once we started production, I couldn't even tell you how many people were on the production, but there was a lot of people doing different things, and it was very fluid and surprisingly seamless. And it was like, I've never been on a film production, but I'm told that it's much like that. Like all of a sudden, when you say go, it's like all these people emerge and do their jobs, and then go away. And that's kind of how it was. We had a question in the back a second ago.
As far as sound design was concerned, in what depth was that? Did it include ambient sound in settings, music? What all did you use?
So there's sound design and music composition are kind of the two halves of that. And I didn't have much to do with that. This was Jeff. He was very hands-on. He's got a guy down in Austin that is very competent audio engineer, runs the studio that McConaughey recorded at. But he sat in the room as far as getting the crickets and the sound effects and the creak of wood and rustle of leaves and all that kind of stuff. That's just, and if you listen to that podcast, it's very dense. The sound design is very dense, and every little piece of that was them sitting in a room. And I don't think they went out and recorded any ambient sounds or anything like that, but audio engineers can subscribe to these huge, massive libraries of sound effects and just just anything you can think of. A knock of wood. Well, do you want oak or cedar or willow, or how hard do you want the knock? It's
Wow.
15 different knock on wood sounds, and I'm sure it's pretty tedious, but also pretty fun, because you're bringing the thing from the page, from the script, to the voice performance, and then really into the imagined world. And then there's the music composition, which Jeff had initially wanted to get the music composer that he's used on a bunch of his movies, named Dave Wingo, to do the score for Hank. For scheduling and contract reasons, that didn't work out. But Q-Code had a guy, kind of on retainer that was really good, and we're like, all right, well, we don't know this guy. Let's see. Try. We want to, an opening theme, and it's just basically like ape on Aaron Copland. Just take Aaron Copland and completely rip off Aaron Copland. And he did it, and he nailed it, knocked it out of the park. So it was like, all right, well, great. This guy that's available is doing a great job. So
what level of control do you have over that process as it's being developed? Do you give up that control, or do you have a way to listen to individual segments and say yes or no? What's the nature of your relationship in that regard?
Well, that's it's an interesting question. Jeff, as with a lot of creators of his caliber, he's pretty he's pretty assertive about I'm going to have the final word. If I'm going to put my name on it, I'm going to have the final word, which only works if we are 95% in agreement with what he wants to do, which we have been. And the nature of this project, one of the reasons it works, we're very opinionated. And so is he. And, that kind of relationship can go sideways in a hurry, but we have such a common vision, I guess, that any issues that we've had have been pretty minor. And it's worked out. It doesn't always work like that, but this one has.
Are the podcasts the be-all and end-all, or would you consider going back to animated?
We consider it. We might be considering it.
It's more of a natural for you.
I was wondering, what, in your opinion, Mr. Erickson, what is your best book that you've ever written?
It's the last one that you read. No, I often tell kids that they can pick their favorite book, but with me, it's like a mother picking her favorite out of 77 kids. And I'm always glad that kids pick a different book. They're not all picking the first one. I would not pick the first one. I didn't know what I was doing when I wrote that thing. Had no idea there would be a second book. And so I would pick one of the later books. I think that I've gotten better and have developed, have continued to learn to hone and polish my writing so that I'm not saying things that I don't need to say. I'm giving my characters the language they need to tell funny stories, and I try to stay out of the way, but yes.
Did you really write your first book in your garage and self-publish it right after that?
Yeah.
Oh.
Sounds crazy, doesn't it? I would say about the dealings with Jeff, Mark has done all of that, and I've stayed away. I don't have Jeff's email. I don't have his phone number. I don't talk to Jeff. And I think that works out best for everybody, because when Jeff told us at a restaurant in San Antonio, Mark was there and Chris was there, and we were talking about possibly doing a movie, and when he said that he was going to write the script, I felt steam going out my ears. And I had to apply a lot of restraints to keep from screaming at him, "Who the hell do you think you are, kid?" I was fighting the publishing war when you were out in the backyard eating grasshoppers. But I didn't say that. Mark had confidence in this man, and I had confidence in Mark. So he's done all the building of the relationship with Jeff, and I have had to learn how to shut up, which is pretty hard. No class at UT I ever took gave me any indication how to do that.
I have a question. Barring just wanting to see your book performed by performers, what was the intent of the podcast? Did it make money? Were you wanting to raise awareness for your books? What was the ultimate goal with making this into a podcast or a movie?
Well, kind of two answers to that question. One is, it's an easier access point to the market. The we didn't get into this business, my part of it, to make podcasts. The goal is for, a film or television life. And doing a podcast is kind of an easier access point. We, pitched the movie around, and, we weren't getting what we wanted out of the market. And so, this was another way to put it together and say, all right, if you're so lacking in imagination that you can't see what a great deal this is, here we'll take it another step further, and you can actually hear it. That's what it is, and it's great. So, that's the ultimate goal. But, the podcast is a business in and of itself, and it's, it has emerged quickly in the last, 5 years or so. Nobody was doing anything like that 5 years ago. And the narrative form, the scripted narrative fiction podcast, is a newer phase, even at that. And yeah, it is a business in and of itself. It's a whole production, and you go out there and you sell ads and sponsorships, and you get income from that. So yeah, kind of both. Our reason for going to the trouble of doing it wasn't just to do a podcast, but it is a thing that has a life of its own.
So then have you seen, because the goal was to make it an easier access point for people to access the stories, have you seen a rise in awareness and sales of the books from the podcast?
I think so.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we are the world's only source for Hank books. And one of our big customers is Ingram, which is a book distributor. And I think that all of Amazon's sales go through Ingram, except maybe the used books, and they farm those out to individual bookstores. But our sales were up 26% last year during the pandemic, and we didn't have any idea what effect it would have on us. If people aren't going to bookstores, that's got to hurt book sales, but it didn't. They might not have gone to Barnes & Noble, but they went someplace else. And one of the interesting distribution ideas that's come about, I think probably as a result of the podcast raising interest outside of Texas, is that we now sell a lot of books to people who are putting together sets of 10 Hank books, and they're selling them on eBay or someplace. I don't know where they're selling them. They're not really officially in the book business, but they are. They're buying large quantities of books to us. There's a guy in California that bought over 1,000 books last week, and he paid with a credit card. And that's really good for us as booksellers, because we went through the days of doing business with Barnes & Noble. No, well, they weren't so bad. Walden Books, B. Dalton, and Hastings. God rest their soul. But we had a lot of trouble getting money out of them. And when we made an issue out of it, they sent them back, and then they reordered them. And then that gave him another 90 days afloat. So when some guy in California buys 1,000 books and puts it on his credit card, that's good business.
I had a question about how complicated were the rights, because you have audiobooks, then the audio podcast, but then there's performance, and did that bleed into anything with any of the other rights? Like, it seems like it would have been a real mess to work out contractually.
Oh, sure, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of contracts. I mean, it simplifies it that, our company, HTC Productions, funded it. And that's not us. We have a group of investors that we raise money to fund this stuff. Mostly people from Perryton, or with some kind of connection to Perryton. And so we financed the podcast, and that simplified a lot, that it's all under one roof. And it won't be so simple with, film and television. Maverick Books has a deal with Audible for the audiobooks. We had to get, a waiver or release from Audible to let us do the podcast, kind of, clear the runway. And then as far as the rights of, well, without getting into a whole deal on copyright
I'm
law.
not trying to get you to spill any secrets or anything.
Well, no, I
was
mean-
curious, since there's two different audio versions, and you answered my question by saying that Audible had to sort of give you a waiver saying, yes, you can produce a different audio
Yeah.
production.
They didn't fight us on. They were nice about it. As far as the what was released, the audio, the final product is an audio recording that includes voice performances based on a script that Jeff wrote based on a book that he wrote. So there's several different copyrights within that audio track. And, the deal we made with Jeff, is we didn't pay him to write the scripts. So he's like, all right, well, I'm going to own the scripts, which, fair deal. So within that audio recording, he's got the podcast script, Dad has the book, and then our company owns the voice performances and the final master copy.
Mark has many talents. He is a leader of a band named Comanche Moon. He's the lead singer, plays guitar and other instruments. He's scriptwriter, songwriter, and writes beautifully, whether it's a letter or something about legal matters. And he comes into this creative field with great preparation. He has a law degree from Texas Tech. And if you can't marry for wealth, then get a law degree. There's got to be some way of making being a creative person a little easier. And we all face the same problem of paying the light bill and being able to eat Mexican food at least once a week at El Bracero. So having a law degree has been very handy for our investor group and also for Mark. I couldn't have done the work that he's done.
You would have gotten bored.
Or shot.
Did you have to do a lot of work with unions in
Yeah.
this production?
Yeah, SAG, Screen Actors Guild. So the production is a SAG production, and the company that we formed to produce the podcast had to become a SAG signatory. And I don't fully understand what that means, except that you fill out all the paperwork, get your stamp, and then what I'm told is that they'll follow me around until my dying day, chasing down residuals for whatever streams we're getting 15 years from now. But that all the contracts are SAG contracts. It's kind of a form, and there's a margin of negotiation within that. And some of the people on the cast are kind of big stars and with big lawyers who like to negotiate contracts. Were many of those, and each one you have to get their contract right, and each one wants something different. And there were many times where we're going back over this certain cast member's contract, and I'm thinking you've got 5 lines in the whole thing. What are we fighting over?
Residuals.
No, there's no residuals.
As long as we're talking about really getting into the weeds of all of this complicated bundle of copyrights and things, I've wondered, because the Hank audiobooks also have your original songs, and I don't know whether they've been recorded separately from the audiobooks, but do BMI and ASCAP come into this in any other way, or any other music rights separate from the performance of the script?
I'm from Perryton. I don't even know what those things are.
Well, questions for Mark.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, for your songs, are you registered with a PRO?
So, does anybody ever perform songs, Hank songs separately, or are they,
Well,
And what would happen if they did?
Yeah.
They do in schools a lot. I think people sing them in the shower, in the deer blind.
BMI might not track that.
I know that we heard from a mother who had 2 sons, and she had just driven back from Amarillo, 120 miles, and they were in the back seat singing a Hank song over and over again, and it was the Coyote Brothers, Rip and Snort, singing, "We're proud to be ignoramuses." And she wondered if I could stop writing songs like that. She thought it was corrupting her kids. I'm very unsophisticated about that kind of business. Maybe we should have registered those songs and tried to sell them as sheet music. I just never have done that. I was lucky to do as much as I did. So we have CDs with Hank Greatest Hits. We must have something like 150 songs now,
Right.
and probably ought to try to do something with them, because some of them,
There's gotta be a Hank songbook.
they're not all trash. Some of them are, but there's some really pretty ones that Mark's mother sings on. She has a beautiful soprano voice, and she plays mandolin.
I have a question for Mark. Have you read Green Lights?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
Have you?
Yes.
Yeah, so what's your point? What was it you're trying to weasel out of Mark?
I just want
No, I may read it later when we're not in contract discussions, but not right now.
It's an interesting read, let me tell you. It's fascinating.
I believe you.
And then I listened to the audiobook where Mr. McConaughey is narrating himself, and that's funny. That's what, I cannot
It's,
imagine anyone else reading his work in a different voice. It wouldn't make any sense.
I wouldn't, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't want to listen to it.
When did y'all start like making songs?
Well, I guess that there were songs from the very beginning. I wanted to do the Hank books as audio books at that time, 1982. There was no such term as audio book. It was books on tape, and there weren't many of them. And but I knew that I could read those stories because that's how I built my audience in the Panhandle. I went out and took every invitation to do a 4-H banquet and a FFA banquet and the Farm Bureau banquet. I was going up into Iowa, Kansas, Montana, even Alberta, Canada, doing Hank readings, reading the same thing that I read in schools years later, but it was always to adults. And so this was storytelling that was similar to what I grew up with, which was not television, it was radio. My dad despised television and didn't want to allow it in the house until 1958 or so, when he finally crumbled. His brother gave us a black and white television because he thought we were becoming an unnormal family. And we were. Mark was raised in an unnormal family. But it was an imitation for me of old-time radio, which had sound effects and different voices. And I was going out and getting paid a few $100 to do programs. And I found out that my acting career in Perryton High School had given me enough acting talent to do the voices of 10 or 15 characters. And so I think probably one of the loudest and most raucous audience I ever read a Hank story to was the Western barley growers in Banff, British Columbia, or Alberta, whichever it is, but a beautiful place. They were drinking their barley. So I could have read the Book of Lamentations and they still would have. But, I was blessed to be shunned by the people who control the entertainment and publishing worlds, because once I said, well, I won't say what I said, but once I decided that I didn't care what they thought and I wasn't going to die or go away, then I was free to do anything I could pay for. The only opinion that matters in the publishing business is the one who pays the printer bill, or in the case of audiobooks, the one who writes a check to the audio refinery in Amarillo. And that meant that I was completely free to do whatever I wanted to with Hank books. And Carlos Caso, who's done all of the recordings, he's a genius he has his own techniques that bring out the humor, with the sound effects. On the 19th book, Case of the Midnight Rustler, there's a scene where Hank gets into Slim's camp meat and eats a whole package of weenies. And he starts off saying he doesn't care for weenies, they got too much garlic in them. And then he eats one and he says, I love weenies. Always love weenies. And then after he finished the whole package, he says, I hate weenies. And he's burping garlic. Well, on that audio book, Carlos had just gotten in a new CD. And the whole thing was belches. And he wanted to use as many as he could, so he had burned in the whole CD in there. And mothers who are trying to raise civilized kids aren't as amused by that as I was. When I heard that the first time, I was driving through Pampa and I had to pull off the road because I was laughing so hard. It was crazy. But the songs came about the same way. I'm not really a good musician. I sang in the Perryton Acapella Choir when I was in high school. It was a darn good choir. Never mind that we're an ugly little windblown town in the Panhandle. We had a good music program. And people who came out of that music program, they stayed with their music. I went to the University of Texas. I sang in the University of Texas Acapella Choir. Most of those people were music majors. I was not anywhere close to the best voice, but I got in. And I play a banjo. I'm not near as good a musician as Mark is, but I'm as good as I need to be. And if I was any better, I don't know what I'd do with it. So I make up songs on my banjo, and Mark arranges them for me now. Plays guitar and harmonica and sometimes drums and synthesizer, but what a great blessing it's been to be able to do whatever I want to do. And sometimes the songs that I come up with are, they're just crazy. Rip and Snort are 8th grade boys. Their brains have been smashed and frozen at the level of an 8th grade boy, which means not quite civilized. I'm remembering myself at that time. And but there's also songs that express their love songs, and there's songs. Mark and I did one that was an instrumental, and the song came from Chris listening to me play a bunch of chords that weren't a song. She said, "What is that?" I said, "Well, it's just chords." She said, "You need to make it into a song." I said, "Well, I don't have any words for it." She said, "You need to make it into a song." So it's about 3 minutes. It's called Our Song, and Mark arranged it, and I swear I listened to it the other day, and I sent him a text and I said, "This is so beautiful. You would think that when the world heard something this beautiful, it would stop and gasp. But nobody noticed. It went right on." He wrote back and said, "Yeah, I feel that way all the time." But we did something beautiful. And I don't give a rip what anybody in New York or California thinks about it. I do it for the people in the Panhandle, for the people in Perryton who go to our church. And we don't give them rotten hot tamales. End of sermon.
Does Wallace the Buzzard have a song?
Yeah, he does. There's one called Buzzard Love. There's one called A Pox on Emily Post. Yes.
Sing them.
No.
Why not?
I get paid to sing, son. Yes, dear.
I just wanted to mention something that I don't think you covered, and that was in the beginning, when you promoted your own books. You went to almost every town in this state. He knows where every town is. If you come from somewhere, He's been there. And he's
Spartacus.
performed. And then he has used his family because we work cheap. And they cleaned up on the stage. We had Mark when he was this high, getting up on the stage, singing "Free the Cookies." And then he grew up, he was too old to be doing that stuff. And so we hired our grandkids, and a lot of them came up and did programs with us on the stage. And people enjoyed seeing families doing things together. And so that was a real nice part of it. And doing your own promoting is very important. It was with us, part of this success.
I still remember back in 1982, 1983, the public library had a meet the author dinner, and you were the main speaker, and y'all came and sang
Yeah.
and played your instruments and things, and it was one of the most enjoyable evenings. Even my husband, who I had to drag to it, enjoyed it. And you were just starting out with that first book.
Well, I'll be darned.
Yeah, it was still a good memory, so I thank you for it.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Have you performed in the Spur?
yes.
Okay, so you
At the,
every
at the Spur Theater downtown. They bus kids in from all over that country to this theater. It's an old theater that they've revived, and they do stage
The
plays
Palace?
there. Huh?
The Palace Theater?
I'm sure there ain't but one.
Well, we are going to have to invite you back now that the Palace Theater is back in business. That's good to know.
Yes,
Where did you get your first book ideas from?
my first book idea. I'm sure I got it from reading some novel that was published in New York City and received great reviews in the New York Times, because that's what what else would you imitate when you're just out of college and starting out? So I wrote for 15 years, and I'd say nothing from that time has survived except the one book that I did write well in that 15 years was my first book, called Through Time in the Valley. And it was an imitation of John Gray's Goodbye to a River, only I did it horseback on the Canadian River between the border and the Oklahoma state line. But everything else got rejected, thank heaven. I think I'd be embarrassed. The New York publishers were probably right about me. What I was doing wasn't near as good as I thought it was. And they forced me to be tougher and more selective and to work harder. And I think there's a point at which that is a lethal scenario where you have been rejected so many times that you can't stand it anymore. And I went through one of those times. I was telling Mark about this several weeks ago. After I'd been writing for 15 years and had not cheated or cut corners or tried to do it in a cheap way, I was still getting rejection slips, and I thought I was going to get accepted by Bantam Books to be a replacement author. They were about to lose Louis L'Amour, and that was I had a wife and 2 kids and Mark on the way, and that almost put me down. I went to bed and slept for 24 hours and had terrible nightmares about being followed by wolves. I was leaving a blood trail and they were following me. And I had never died before, so I didn't really know what to expect, but I I thought that I might not survive that. But I did. And that's when I started looking for another way to publish books. And that's when I started Maverick Books. That's when I discovered Hank the Cowdog. Lord have mercy, that was a blessing. I just didn't recognize it. I didn't like it. I didn't want it. That wasn't what I was praying for. But we don't always, the story, we have to live long enough to see the story fill itself out. And a lot of times, what we end up with is a whole lot better than what we started wanting for, because of a lack of maturity or imagination. We don't know how high we can dream. But I was able to do the impossible. I was a creative man who was able to write anything he wanted to and go to the audio refinery and read anything into that microphone that I wanted to. And I never shamed my mother in the process. I've made a pretty good living. What a deal.
I'll tell you what, it's about time for a break. Everybody stretch their legs, get some refreshments, use the bathroom. So why don't we do that for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and see if we want to talk about some more stuff, all right?
We'll also have raffles.
In the afternoon, when I saw the first smoke, I saw it. It started on the next ranch that joined us on the west. And a pumper called and said, I think there's a fire on Wheeler Wilson's place. You better figure out where it is. And the wind was out of the southwest, blowing 50 miles an hour. And it didn't look as though that fire would get us, because it was taking it towards Lipscomb and maybe Canadian. But that was started by an electrical line failure. And when the wind's blowing 50 miles an hour, any of those lines can start falling apart. And if we had one fire, we might have more than that coming straight with the wind. And so we just grabbed our Mac computers and Chris's mandolin and jumped in the car and headed for Perryton. We couldn't get there because the fire was already blocking the road. It was just an enormous black cloud. Looked like an atom bomb had gone off. So we turned around, drove 19 miles to get on another highway, and we made it to Perryton. And I thought when the wind died down in the evening, it would be okay for us to go back. But the wind changed to the north, and it went down into our canyon. Nobody ever called us to tell us that it was burning. But Mark couldn't sleep that night, so he got up. Why don't you tell him about that, Mark?
Well, I've been, in touch with anybody and everyone that I could get information from. I was in touch with my brother Scott, with Dad, and neighbors of ours, and especially a friend of mine that I grew up with, went to high school with, and he still lives in Perryton. He was out supplying water to one of the fire crews out there. And, I was asking him, where is it, relative to us. And at some point in the night, his report started sounding like, he didn't know exactly where our place was, but from what he was telling me, it sounded like, yeah, it's on us. So, I don't know, 11 o'clock or so that night, 11 or 12, I just packed a little overnight bag and hit the road, drove up there, on the ranch is in the Canadian River Valley, and so on the north side of the Canadian River Valley. And so coming in from the south, from a high point, I could see I could see the fire from, several miles away. And, I've got a pretty good radar GPS for, where in this black space our place was, and it looks like where the fire was. So I drove in there. The fire was well down into the valley, south of our place, well south of our place. And, late at night with fire burning all over the place in rough country, you got to be pretty careful about what you get yourself into. So I pulled off the road and slept until dawn, and then came in the next morning through the west side of the ranch. And yeah, we were burned up pretty bad. There was live fire all over the place, and it would continue to burn for a week or so after that. The night of, it made a big pass through, and fire moved really fast and burned up a lot, but it sort of mopped up for the rest of the week. Fire would meander over this way and then meander over back this way. But it had gotten us pretty bad when I was in there, and of course, so I drove through a smoking, smoldering, burning ranch and got up to the vital organs part of the ranch, and the bunkhouse was burned down, the house was burned down, and Dad's writing office was burned down. And I called them up, gave them the bad news, and then went to check cattle. And it's all, the book includes my account of that day.
And what the book is about is called Bad Smoke, Good Smoke, a rancher's view of wildfire. And I kept careful records, even though I no longer had my library of journals. I didn't have any blank journals to write on, so I was doing this on the computer. And that's what I did every morning. I've always been a very disciplined writer. I go to my writing place at 5:30 in the morning and stay for 4.5 hours. So we had no house. I had no office. We were living in town, and so I started going to Maverick Books' office in the warehouse and working at Gary Rinker's desk and keeping notes of what we were doing every day. Mark stayed with us. Ironically, the last person to stay the night in that bunkhouse was Jeff Nichols. He had been up to visit us, spent Thursday night in the bunkhouse, went into Perryton and met our investor group, and then one of the investors flew him back down to Austin, and that fire was Monday. So anyway, for the next 3 months I recorded what was going on. Mark and I were trying to feed cattle that had nothing to eat except ashes and dirt. And I had 16 bales of alfalfa when that fire hit. They didn't burn, but that wouldn't go very far. So all at once, trucks started showing up with loads of hay. People were calling me up. I don't know where they got my number, but they'd say, "I'm from Bracketville, Texas. I'm in Canadian. Where do you want this hay?" I said, "What hay?" "Well, I got 35 bales of good alfalfa or prairie hay or cane hay. And one guy who showed up in Canadian, I gave him directions. He came with his 12-year-old son and it delivered 16 bales of prairie hay. And his son was a Hank fan, and he heard about it somewhere and said, "Dad, I want to take Mr. Hank some hay." So they drove 16 hours. And, people were giving us clothes. This jacket, it was, came my way 3 days after the fire. I had no clothes. Just whatever, blue jeans and a denim shirt. And so that's what this book is about. Bad Smoke, Good Smoke. And it's about, I'm a sort of an amateur naturalist because I live on a ranch and that's something I care deeply about. It seems to be the only thing I can write about. So I watch and I study grass and animals and and so that's what Bad Smoke, Good Smoke is about. Now I sent that originally to Texas A&M Press, and they sent it to some readers, and the readers recommended that they not publish it. So naturally, I took that with a cheerful, sweet attitude. But I'm glad that they did because the story wasn't over. I thought that, I think I was writing this every day, just throwing it together as fast as I could, and after 4 or 5 months, I thought, well, that's the end of it. I'm ready to send it off. But it wasn't the end of it. The fires came back the next year. On the anniversary of that fire, we were looking at red flag fire days. Chris was packing her things, what things she had left, and taking them to town and staying the night. And I was on fire alert, spraying water on the sides of my little office that Scott Erickson found for me. And that went on for 2 or 3 more years. And but I sent it to Texas Tech Press. They were not first on my list because, I think that they've gone through kind of a dark period, and I wasn't aware of things that they were publishing, but they and Maverick Books are the only presses I knew about in this whole godforsaken country. So I sent it, and an editor there really liked it, and she was a good editor, and she gave me good advice on stick to what you see and what you know. Don't read a bunch of books by fire experts. I did some of that, and I benefited from it, but she convinced me that I need to cut a bunch of chapters out. And that's really hard when you've been at this business as long as I have, to cut chapters out. But they liked it, and they brought it out this month. And it will have a limited audience compared to the Hank books, but that's okay with me. There's some people that remember those 2 fires. I had a ringside seat to both of them. And they're the biggest fires in Texas history. That Perryton fire that we were in, 318,000 acres, it's the 3rd biggest fire in Texas history. The first biggest was the one in 2006 that missed us. But there were, that same day, was also the LaForge fire that killed 3 kids who were trying to move some cattle. And the biggest of all was up in the Oklahoma Panhandle went up into Kansas. It was 700,000 acres, called Starbuck Fire. But that was a heck of a day. And, you know, one of the things that struck me about these events was that my kinfolks on the South Plains, Estacado, Lubbock, and Gaines County, Seminole, they talked about grasshoppers and droughts, dust storms, blizzards, hailstorms, but they didn't talk about the kind of wildfires that we saw. This is something new. It's a kind of fire that we had no memory of. And so I was curious to know why, what's happened, what's different, and is this something that we're going to have to live with for a long time? So that's my nonfiction book.
And it just came out this month?
Yes.
What went into the decision to submit it to the university presses rather than publish it with Maverick Books?
Maverick Books is in the Hank business. My business partner has an accounting degree, and he's not about to publish anything that's not about Hank Cowdog.
There you go.
So I can either do it with my own money or find somebody else. And I'm in the Hank business full time. Writing about prairie fires and cowboys is just kind of a hobby. And so university presses, they make pretty books. They keep them in print. You can't count on them to sell many. If you want sales, you better find an audience and go sell them yourself. Talk to the ladies group who's interested in books, or find somebody who's interested in what you're writing about. So I'll be going to a conference at Tech at the end of this month. I'll be on a panel with people probably with doctorates who are talking about prairie fires and preventive burns, such as that. So it's a different kind of promotion than I've done before.
Just question popped up. They'll ask you on the panel, would preventive burns done anything in 17 and 18? Would it have helped at all?
Well, I think theoretically, yes, they would have. But our part of the country is not emotionally ready to drop a match into
On purpose.
into grassland. We have no farmland in this valley. It's all grass. And to me, the most intimidating part of preventive burns is the chance of lawsuits. You know, if the fire gets out of control, and fire burners will tell you, they always get out of control. Sometimes they get them stopped and sometimes they don't. But if they don't, that fire can go all the way from our west pasture to the Oklahoma state line. And there's a bunch of little towns in between and a few ranch houses and a lot of cattle and a lot of fence that costs $15,000 a mile to replace. So,
And our country's very rough, so it's kind of uniquely challenging. I mean, the idea of prescribed burns is something that we've been vaguely interested in for a long time and acutely interested in since 2017. And yeah, to answer your question, I think, sure, if in theory, like you said, in theory it would help because, you know, you're getting rid of a lot of fuel. You know, what we had was a lot of dry, tall grass and cedar trees. That's all fuel to a fire. And, you know, now we're in pretty good shape withstand a fire because that's been done, although the grass is back. But yeah, I mean, when you think about a prescribed burn, you imagine a controlled environment. Well, we don't really have an environment that's easy to control. And yeah, it'll send a shiver down your spine thinking about the possibilities of what could happen if you tried it out.
You
And
think
it
the
didn't
wind's
work
not
out
gonna
like
blow
you hoped
50
it
that
would.
day, and it does, so.
Yeah.
Just a side note, I'm from Flint Hills, Kansas. I don't know if you've ever been in that part of the country. It's beautiful rolling hills from Wichita kind of area, further north of Wichita.
I did one of my first tank programs for the Cattle Raisers Association in Emporia. Yeah.
Emporia, Kansas, that's my hometown.
Huh.
So Cottonwood Falls, Chase County, Strong City, all that. There in the Flint Hills, there's a lot of pasture land for grazing. And you could get lost in those pastures and never find your way back if you don't know where you're at. But every year, they burn the pasture lands on a controlled, I guess it's similar to what you're talking about, controlled burn. To my knowledge, it's never gotten out of hand. And on Facebook, when it's going on, people up there take pictures and show the burns that they do. But they do that every year for the bluegrass that they grows there to come back and be healthy, I guess, for grazing purposes. So I know their topography, I guess if that's the right word, is different than it would be here. But I just thought I'd toss that out there because they've been doing that for generations up there.
Yeah, they have a long tradition of burning because your types of grass, those tall grasses, they're very strong in the spring and summer. And there's a point where you have to get the cattle off because it's like eating wood. There's no protein value in it. It's just cellulose. So in the fall of the year, Flint Hills is an enormous field of cellulose. And if they don't get that old grass out of the way, there'll be no opportunity for the grass to come up green again. So you have to get that out of the way. Our grass is quite different from that. It maintains protein value throughout the winter. It goes down, but we've never really had a need to do controlled burns because of the grass. As a result, we've gotten a lot of vegetation in that's highly flammable, such as tamarack trees in the river bottom and the junipers and cedar, which are almost explosive when they get dry. And they're an invader tree that needs to be burned and killed out, but nobody wants to drop the match. What would you say to your neighbor if the fire got off of you and on him?
Sorry, doesn't cut it.
Yeah.
Oops. Okay, on to a more pleasant subject or happier subject. Where do you guys see publishing going? Because I don't know anybody that's even trying to pitch to New York anymore. Of course, I'm new. I mean, I'm still infant in the writing industry, but is anybody other than their stable of writers pitching to the big five anymore?
You know, I've lived a sheltered life because the last New York editor I talked to was Lou Lamore's editor, Erwin Applebaum at Phantom Books. And he broke my heart. And I haven't talked to an editor since then. I haven't chased one around the hotel lobby, and it's really been nice. So I'm badly out of touch. I just know my little area of expertise, and I don't subscribe to writers' magazines anymore, and where I live, there's not many writers around. So Taylor Moore, I met him when he was working in the oil field on my ranch, and he was interested in writing at the time, and but there are not many of those working in the oil field. So I'm badly out of touch. Mark has a little bit more experience in that than I do.
Well, I'm a spectator to the publishing business, although I'm good friends with Taylor, and we're writing partners on a series we're doing for Sharpened Iron, as it happens. And he's really the guy to ask that question to. I've kind of been, he and I left our real jobs around the same time to pursue crazy dreams, and kind of supported each other throughout that. And so what I know is through kind of being along his side and his journey. And I had just about come to the conclusion that the conventional model of publishing was dead, and was schooled and steeped in this model. What I grew up in was him doing it on his own, and I kind of, I was really surprised. I mean, not totally surprised, but Taylor had success in that model of the getting the big publisher and actually getting a good deal, and I was shocked. Because I just didn't think that kind of deal was out there anymore. But he proved me wrong. I don't know, but he would be the guy to ask, because he's been through that whole thing.
I have the opposite question. A lot of us in here do self-publish or work with small presses, or work for small presses in some cases. What you've been doing this sort of thing for basically longer than I've been alive, it seems like. So what are some of a few things that no matter how the market changes, no matter all that stuff, that has always been true about trying to sell books to an audience? Because you talked about going and finding the audience. So when it comes time to try to get them to buy your product, what are some of the things that you have helped keep your business alive?
Well, I must confess that I have been helped a lot by either dumb luck or divine providence. Because even when I started Maverick Books, I thought I was going to be writing cowboy stories and selling them at ranch rodeos and county fairs. And that's where I went. That was my original audience. It was adults involved in agriculture. And I did not see Hank as a character that had star quality. And but I read that one of the first Hank stories, it was a short story that ran in the Cattleman magazine of all places. And I read it aloud to audiences in Perryton and Spearman and Guyman, Oklahoma, Liberal, Kansas. And I read it at the Rotary Club in Perryton. And this optometrist came trotting up afterwards. He almost had a hernia during the reading of it. He came trotting up and said, "John, that is great. You need to do more with that dog." And I had never thought of that. So I guess that's when I got the idea of giving Hank a book to himself, a novel, short novel. And I didn't know whether I could do it or not. But I gave it a shot, got 3 chapters done and ran out of gas. I went down to the home of a cowboy friend of mine out in the country and asked if he'd let me read my 3 chapters to him. And so I did in his living room, and he had tears running out his eyes and said, "Man, that is great, you got to finish that book." So I went back the next day and started on chapter 4 and got going, had a silly conversation between Hank and Grover, and then the famous boxer chapter 4 in the first book, where there's this big boxer on the chained up in a pickup next to him, and he growls at him, tells him to shut up. Grover says, "What would you do if we peed on your tires?" And man, it took off from there. And but I thought my audience for that book was going to be cowboys, ranchers, farmers, in places like Emporia, Kansas, and Hereford, Texas, and Perryton. And I never thought of them as children's books. Now, my wife, when she edited, she was my editor, when she read the first book, she said, "This would make a great children's story." And I said, "I do not write children's books. I was a Plan 2 major at the University of Texas. They don't even believe in children." So guess what? I'm going to the children's book author now. Because you can starve to death trying to sell books to cowboys.
Yeah.
And the place to go is where women are. Women are the preservers of civilization. The men are buying pickups and horse feed. And so I started doing programs in schools. I thought of these books as adult humor. This was my best chops as a writer from Plan 2 at the University of Texas. It was my best writing. And I thought it was way too subtle for kids. I mean, the narrator is 5 bales short of a full load of hay. And he's also a little dishonest. He doesn't tell the truth all the time. That's pretty subtle. Kids picked it up right away. They do that all the time. Tell the truth half the time. Exaggerate. So they understood the characters. And I began getting calls from schools to do programs. And that's how I learned that I was an author of children's books. Another thing Chris said at the beginning was to make a beautiful family movie. And of course, we've been pursuing that. I chased that car down the street for 30 years and it wore me out, and Mark came along and he took it over, and we're still chasing that car down the street. But one thing we've done right is that we have never allowed anybody to make a stupid, cheap, ugly movie out of it. And it's easy to find a deal. It's hard to find a good deal. So that's what we're trying to do. I don't remember what the question was, but
That's the answer.
Long answer.
be shy. Anybody else got anything else they want to ask?
I'll make a quick question, because I've never read your books, but what age?
Go stand in the corner.
I will buy some after this. But what age group of children are your books normally for, or what is the age group that buys your books? Is there an age range?
Teachers have answers to that question. I get fan mail from women who are in their 90s in a rest home, and they're reading Hank books.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I don't know. I now try to write for a general 3-generation audience. But when they get into the schools, I think they officially start reading them through accelerated reader in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. There is a prime time in a child's life when he is open to reading, and the parents are trying to encourage the child to read. I think that shuts off sometime in junior high and in high school. They're reading for either a profession or else they're preparing for college, and they don't read for pleasure anymore.
Well, I asked that question because my grandchildren, what they get for their birthdays and Christmas is books. Nothing else. So I'm running out of options that I can find, and I'm trying to find an age range. So now your book's going to be the next gift.
HankTheCowdog.com is the place for you. We have a website with a store, and we have a lady who gives us a Facebook presence. And there are a lot of teachers and mothers who appreciate the material we have on Facebook. Like there was an article that Nikki ran last week. It was a reprint of a blog piece by a woman who has a doctorate in music and teaches in North Carolina, and she writes curriculum for homeschoolers and Christian schools. I met her at a convention for Christian schools about 3 weeks ago, and she has a daughter who's always been a big Hank fan, and but she was astonished that I wasn't just kind of a hick. And that one of the first things I asked her when I found out she was a musician was if she liked the music of Morton Lurison, who's a composer in California, whose sacred music, choral music, is absolutely divine. She was stunned that this hick knew who Morton Lurison was. So she wrote an article about that. She did some digging on the Hank musical side, which interested her and her audience. But that sort of thing shows up on our Facebook page.
All right, well, if nobody has anything else, we thank you guys so very much for coming. Let's give them a huge And it was brought to my attention that during our welcome, I skipped over the part where we let people talk about any books that they have recently published.